Hi everyone, I'm Susan Birch and welcome to another episode of the Health Detective podcast. Sometimes a few people pop up in the health space that really make a difference. And today's guest is one of those people. Today I have Jim Stephenson with me, and he is an expert on vitamin D and the role of vitamin D in our body, and in particular, the supplementation of vitamin D. So today I'm going to be learning as much as everybody else, but I'm really looking forward to hearing what Jim has to say. So Jim, thanks so much for coming along.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, so I think this is such an important topic and message, and it's one where, I'm sure as we go through the podcast, we'll see where allopathic and also alternate medicine have this huge focus on vitamin D supplementation through COVID, vitamin D and zinc supplementation. And, the picture isn't as rosy as we might all think it is. So anyway, let's start with introducing you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you get into becoming such an expert on vitamin D?
Well, it was kind of by accident. What ended up happening was I had a family member that ended up going to a doctor, had several things wrong with them, and they did a vitamin D test. And then they quickly blamed everything that was wrong with the person on the vitamin D level. Osteoporosis, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, things like that. And it was at that point where I started learning about vitamin D. I didn't really know anything about vitamin D before that I can recall, to be honest with you. But this person ended up on a prescription, the 50,000 IU D2 prescription, and the vitamin D level initially was 23. This is the US measurements in G. And that was considered low. And they gave her the prescription, and the vitamin D dropped to 11. It didn't go up, which didn't make any sense to me. And that got my interest in it. And I wanted to learn about it. So I started researching it right then because that didn't make any sense to me.
And, I'm sure that we would all expect our vitamin D to go up with supplementation. So we'll talk about that shortly, about why it may not go up. Could you just talk about, the different forms of vitamin D, what we're familiar with, D2, D3, and then this, 125D, what we measure, what we don't measure, and why that's so important.
Sure. So D3 is what we would consider the animal form or human form. That's what we make when we go in the sun. That's what's found in, say, salmon, things like that. That's the naturally occurring animal form of D3. D2 is from mushrooms and stuff. Mushrooms can have D2, D3, or D4. Depends on whether you expose them to the sunlight or not. And so those are at the level of what we would call a vitamin. That's what we discovered in the late 20s or early 30s. And then what ends up happening is that molecule goes to your liver where it becomes hydroxy. It gets hydroxylated. It gets changed at a spot on its skeleton, so to speak, at the 25, what's numbered 25. So that's why it's called 25-OH-D3. So where it's changed. And later when it becomes 125D in the in the kidneys, it's changed at the position 1, as well as already have the change at 25. So it becomes 1,25-OH2D3. So that's the basis of that. We didn't discover the 25D or the 125D until the late 60s, early 70s. And so these are going to be the molecules that got on everybody's radar early on. And people seem to believe that that's the most important pathway, even though we've discovered numerous ones later.
Right, interesting. And so when vitamin D goes from the D2 to the D3, where it's a vitamin, and then it goes to the kidneys where it's converted into the 125D, then it has hormonal effects. Is that right?
That is correct, but I missed the very first part of what you said. And if I heard it right, you said D2 becoming D3?
Or vitamin D2 and D3.
Oh, okay. All right. Because some people do get confused and they think that we start with D2 and it becomes D3. And I just want to make sure I heard you correctly. So yeah, that's what we consider the vitamin level. And those were the first things discovered.
Yeah. And so that's why, because you run a website called secosteroid hormone. Yeah. And I think one of the really important takeaways is that we are affecting our hormones when we're taking supplemental vitamin D, or even when we're, converting it from the sunshine. So
right.
It's not an innocent vitamin that our body doesn't make.
Right. It's a pretty powerful molecule. The 125 D3 is the most powerful naturally occurring steroid in your body, and it does a lot of important stuff. But being it's a secosteroid, and all that really means is that it has one carbon ring that isn't complete. There's not really any difference between a true steroid and it, just because of that. So it's a really powerful molecule in the body, and it needs to be checked because it can get high, in sick people. I know a lot of people think that the sick people have low vitamin D. Actually, they have the opposite. They have high vitamin D. We're just not looking at the right molecule. Right.
So let's talk about that. So, when my clients go to the doctor and they get a vitamin D test, they're getting the 25 OHD tested. And, more recently, I've been just testing out the medical system to see if we can get the 125 OHD tested, and it just comes back no way. Like, what are you even talking about, you crazy woman?
Yep. They don't want to test that. They have everybody convinced that if your 25D is low, that your 125D is going to be low also, and that isn't turning out to be the case in sick people. It's the opposite. The low 25D is coupled in sick people with high 125D.
So can you explain why that is? What's happening? Why would so is it true that 25 D is a storage form of D, and that's found in our serum?
Yeah, it's a storage form. So it's stored in the liver, it's stored in muscle, it's stored in fat, it's even stored in bone. And so that's the molecule that when the body needs it, it will liberate it. So typically you would have it would go to your liver and it would be stored there and it would be released as needed. So what you're seeing, what they're measuring in your blood or serum, whatever you want to call it, is what the body has decided to release to there. It's not a magical thing that it arrived there. The body decided to let it be there. And so the body decided how much to be there, because you have a lot of it stored in your body.
Right. So why would we be releasing it then? Is that so that it can then be transported to be used, or does it get eliminated, or what's...
Okay. So the 125D is what I call the molecule of immune response. So if you need to have an immune response, say you need to make some T cells, you need macrophages, anything that molecule makes. And it's important to understand that that's what the 125D does. It works with its own receptor, the vitamin D receptor, and the RXR, the retinoid receptor, with vitamin A, and they come together. Both receptors come together. It's called heterodimerize. Each one is a dimer, and they come together and they heterodimerize, and they go into the nucleus of the cell to do a job that's already predetermined. Make that T cell, make a specific white blood cell, whatever the DNA that is presented there for it to make. So the body's already decided it wants to make something. So then it will request the building materials, and 125D is one of the building materials. So it'll make sure that there's some activated, and that's how it works.
Right. So it would be fair comment to call the 25D storage D and then the 125D active D, and that keeps it nice and simple.
Yeah, that's exactly how you should do it.
Yeah. And so the active D is a response. So we need D, right? Like, it's super important.
Yes.
Yeah. And we need it for our immune system. We need it for building bone. calcium regulation. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So when it comes to calcium regulation, that's of course going to be controlled by the active form of vitamin D, not the storage form of vitamin D. And unfortunately, with the raising of the goal in 2010 for the blood level, in the US measurements, it went from 12.5 ng to 30 plus. They like to put the plus sign on there. They don't just put 30 plus. And a lot of people don't even put a cap on that. So that molecule is truly the storage molecule. And there are studies that show that people are liberating that in the winter because it does have a seasonal variation. You're not making D3 in the winter. Therefore, your amount of 2,5-D that's just a natural throughput, let's call it, through the body, if it's willing to, that's just your natural throughput. So naturally, that would get lower when you're not making D3. And that's where the body steps up and liberates stored 25D for that system. It's best to think about the tests they're doing would be like if you're driving your car and you were concerned about the fuel line rather than your fuel tank. So the liver is in essence your fuel tank, and we're looking at the fuel line. Right. So that's what's going on.
Right. Okay. There's so much in there. So let's go back to the pattern. So we have a kind of circadian rhythm with it, don't we? You know, like is it a 24-hour circadian rhythm that we have with vitamin D, and then we've got seasonal variations? Is that correct?
There is a circadian rhythm somewhat in the 125D. I haven't seen any work on there being a circadian rhythm in the 25D. Yeah. But on days that you could make D3, of course, that would fall into your circadian rhythm as you produced it too. Yeah. So, and it being the sunshine molecule, it's a diurnal kind of thing. So it is a daylight thing. Yeah, absolutely.
Because there's a lot of talk, you know, we see a lot of talk that, you know, we don't make vitamin D all year round, you know, there's smog, there's people live in low light conditions, different conditions, people with dark skin, and they're not able to get enough D from the exposure to the sun. We're all wearing sunscreen. There's all this worry about cancer.
Yeah, there is all that worry about it. The thing about vitamin D is, though, that we have been convinced that we need a lot of it, and they've done that in various ways. But you have to think about vitamin D in and of itself. It's rare in food sources. Your body turns dark to limit how much of it you produce. So it really doesn't stand to reason that you want tons of it. The body wouldn't react like that to it, where you get dark so you make less of it. That's the net effect of getting darker. And so we've just become convinced through association-based papers that are built completely around 25D without ever measuring anyone's active form of vitamin D to make sure that there is an issue. You know, if you're low and if you believe you're low in 25D, that would result in being low in 125D. No one is able to show that in any of the literature. That's just not the case. And I think they're unfortunately not measuring anymore because they're finding out it's actually high in a lot of those people.
Mm. And this is what you started off talking about, that, you know, basically low 25D, and then we've got to try and even determine what low means, because, you know, we can talk about the fact that they changed the levels fairly recently, but low 25D, if it is truly low, is really a proxy marker for being sick, for inflammation, for infections. And that means that active D is going to be high.
Yeah, and then we're finding that the active D is high because the body, let's talk about a person who's going to end up with low 25D coupled with high 125D. That's going to be a person that has a pathogen in them. Let's say Lyme's a good example. A lot of people struggle with Epstein-Barr. That's another good one. I mean, HIV even, for that matter. And I mentioned those three pathogens because those three pathogens are all known to make a molecule that is the appropriate shape, very similar to vitamin D, so that it is able to take the vitamin D receptor away from the vitamin D molecules. So say a person has mono, Epstein-Barr virus. The presence in their body is going to cause the body to activate 2,5-D to 1,2,5-D because it's the molecule of immune response. And that's going to be so that the body can make chemical or biological warriors to deal with the Epstein-Barr. The problem is that pathogens in your body causing you to make the active vitamin D, but it's stolen the vitamin D receptors where that molecule needs to go to execute its job. So you have 125D that can't do its job. It can't make its chemical or biological warriors. And the only way that it can downregulate itself is by getting to the vitamin D receptor. So it rises unabated. And so you end up with high 125D. So once you lost that tight regulation because it stole the receptors, that molecule has a higher attraction to some other systems other than the vitamin D receptor, the thyroid receptors, for example, than their own natural molecule T3 in this example. So T3 needs to get to the beta receptor of the thyroid. Well, because the vitamin D, the active form, couldn't get to its own receptor, it will very quickly steal the thyroid receptor.
Right.
And here's where I want to stress one other thing that people need to understand. It isn't just the vitamin D system that makes chemical warriors. The thyroid system makes chemical warriors as well. They're called antimicrobial peptides and defensins. So not only did you lose the function of the vitamin D system and the chemical warriors that it makes that there's no immunity to, it also took out your thyroid function and the defensive part of the thyroid system as well. So you have a complete cascade of events there when you have high 125D, and like you pointed out early, you can't even get it tested.
So that's a natural process that our body is using to fight inflammation and infection. So does that mean that, that 125D, regardless of whether you're supplementing or not, is going to, that those, like mono is going to grab hold of those receptor sites. And so that 125D is going to automatically rise anyway. And then how does that work in the system if that's the case?
Okay. It's going to rise in the sense that it's not used in the appropriate receptor, but it will get used up. It will still go away during its normal half-life, but it's continually being produced because the pathogen isn't getting attacked, right, because it's not making the appropriate warriors for it. And so what ends up happening is you'll reach a point where the body realizes that it has too much vitamin D, it can't get to its receptor and downregulate itself. So your body goes into what's known as VDR deactivation mode, VDR deac, because the body understands that it's not functioning properly. So it ceases to express vitamin D receptors, so they can no longer be stolen. And that also affects the sensitivity as well as acquisition of vitamin D from either sun or from diet. So the body is going to down-regulate the amount of 25D in your blood so that situation stops. And that's what you see in all the sick people when they have low 25D. It's the body making a conscious decision to sequester that from blood in a protective act. Now, if you want to compare that to another protective act, a perfect example is anemia of chronic disease, chronic illness, where the body knows that the pathogens are using iron against you, it's sequestered from blood, and all those people get labeled anemic. And so both those things can run hand in hand as well. So a lot of people have iron anemia and vitamin D deficiency. And in the vast majority of them, that's a protective act that we are then talked into overriding.
And then we're talked into overriding it by taking supplementation for it.
Correct.
Yeah. And so when the vitamin D is receptors are deactivated and, we have that negative feedback system. So then how are those pathogens killed? Like what's the effect on the immune system for that? Because it must be done in an intelligent way.
Right. So if they could get to the receptors and make the antimicrobial peptides in the host of what I call they're just all warriors. There's chemical and biological warriors. If it can get to its receptor and make those, that's going to give you the fighting chance. A lot of people know that some of these things are really hard to deal with. Like Lyme isn't easy to overcome, but there are other molecules that will also remove things from the vitamin D receptors. They're called vitamin D receptor antagonists. And so that's one way to get your receptors available to vitamin D again, is to utilize one of those. Sage and rosemary are vitamin D receptor antagonists. And so they will help liberate or clear out your receptors and let your system try to get back in line.
So when people don't feel well, they have their storage D checked and they're told it's low, and then sometimes they're given really high dose vitamin D supplementation, and then they say they feel better. What's happening in that situation?
Well, I typically address that three ways. One is that you have to keep in mind that if it's becoming the active form of vitamin D, that's a really powerful steroid, secosteroid. It's like palliative treatment with prednisone. So you can get some relief from the molecule itself. But there are two other things at play. And people don't like to hear these other, the first one they don't like to hear, placebo. Placebo, if you believe in that, you can have biological activity from what you believe in. And the best example of that is when they're trying new chemo drugs and they have the placebo arm of the treatment. These people they don't know they're getting a placebo. So they expect their hair to fall out. 65% of them have their hair fall out. So you can believe in something and make it happen. And that may be triggered through what they've termed the God gene. It's called VMAT2. You can look it up. There's a really good paper on Nature, how faith is hardwired into our genes. And that's about that. So you can believe in something and have a positive reaction from it, and it can be truly biological. That's really hard for people to grasp, but it's real and it's been proven.
And do you think it might sort of temporarily ramp up the immune system or something so people feel a bit better? Or
I think in the sense of prednisone type effects it would, but without any ability to get to the vitamin D receptors, it's not making any chemical or biological warriors. And unlike a lot of other molecules that people struggle with, let's say somebody has low protein, low albumin, there's a lot of other things that people could be trying to increase the level of in their body, where they will check where it's going when they put it in you. Especially proteins are really good, and they'll do a protein workup. If you have low protein and you're eating a lot of protein and your protein isn't showing up in the test, they'll check. Not vitamin D. It's always just take more. Just take more.
And I looked up the New Zealand, the GP guidelines for prescribing vitamin D, and they don't even check now because they don't want to pay the money to have it checked. So they're trying to reduce the overhead costs, and they just say, just prescribe it. If you think someone is an at-risk population, just prescribe it. So in the winter, anyone who is older, anyone with dark skin, just give them some vitamin D supplementation.
Right. And it's all based upon a goal they set for 25D and looking at 6 people's level of 25D. And so it's an association. The sick people have low 25D. Is it the reason they're sick? Well, you can only prove that by looking to see if it's causing a shortage in the molecule that does the work, and they're not doing that. And when it is done, you find that these people aren't low. The only people that are going to be low in 125D are the dead or the ones that have a defect, and they're going to have to take it. directly. They're not going to be able to make it. And we're talking hypoparathyroidism, chronic kidney disease, these folks. And these chronic kidney disease people, they may have gotten that boat from making their kidneys activate too much vitamin D.
Super interesting. The research I've read, and vitamin D and zinc is another one, and vitamin C as well is another one, where people will go into hospital, they'll test their storage D, or they'll test their zinc or their vitamin C, and they go, oh, they're low. So they're low and they're sick. So now we have this association. Being low has caused the sickness. Then they supplement, and then they go, oh, we're really disappointed with the results because it didn't actually make any difference.
Yeah, it never works out. And that's why they don't want to pay for the tests anymore. This is a lot like chelation therapy. If you had lead burdens in your body and you wanted to have it chelated and it wasn't work related, the insurance is going to step up and pay for that. And the reason why, and they'll tell you, is because there's no peer-reviewed published data that shows that benefits people. But we all know it would. It's just that nobody is funding that study. It's a waste of money. It's common sense removing lead from the body would be beneficial. But they are trying like crazy to prove that the vitamin D works and can't. They're spending tons of money on it. So now they're able to not test it. And it doesn't, their intervention studies don't work. Outside of the kind of esoteric, I feel better, there's no real biological stuff that anyone can point to in an intervention. It isn't bearing out at all. They cannot prove it as an intervention, but they still cling to the fact that the 25D being low is the cause of that illness, even though it doesn't correct it. And you have to keep in mind, one lemon cured scurvy. So if this were truly the cause, intervention studies would work.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's interesting too, because one lemon cured scurvy, but yet we should be having, all this vitamin D, vitamin C infusions, and and I mean that's a whole other topic. But
right,
yeah, we're kind of making associations sometimes, I think, where they really aren't. So can you talk about what the dangers are? So, we know that this active D is going to rise. So what does that do? Heart disease, bone osteoporosis. There's a whole list of things, maybe an increased risk of cancer.
Sure. Let's start from the very heart of it, where you're starting with D3, and let's talk about, you go in the sun, you make D3, or you take a pill of it.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go with pill. You can eat it also, but it's a little different when it's in food. It's locked up differently than an isolated pill. So when you go into the sun, your body's going to begin with a form of cholesterol called 7-dehydrocholesterol. The sun it's a photolyable molecule. So the sun, you can call it, degrades it, it alters it, it changes it to another molecule. That's where it becomes D3. Okay. When you're in the sun continues to hit the D3 that you created, and it can continue to change it to another molecule called L3, lumisterol. And this is a super important molecule that they labeled inert. Once you make it for 72 hours with just the heat of the body, no light, it can revert back to D3. So it's like, it's going to go both ways. It's like a pressure spring right in the middle. You can't make that in the gut. When you put D3 in the gut, you're not using 7-dehydrocholesterol. You're not using light. It's arriving as D3. There's no sun going to hit it and move it to another molecule. But you also have to keep in mind, when you take the pill of D3, you're not using any of your 7-dehydrocholesterol to make it. So you're already impacting your lipid panel by messing with these lipid-based hormones. And so you're already intervening with something. But at the same time, the D3 that you take in a pill form is going to have to be shuttled by LDL cholesterol. And keep in mind, they're going to be wanting to ratchet you down on how much LDL cholesterol you have. Yet you take in vitamin D3, you're forcing your body to have it carry it around for you. So there's another impact to the lipid panel. But in the sun, there's a lot of other molecules. I won't muddy the waters with that, but that cannot be made inside the body in the same way. And you need some of those molecules to be where you make them. Some of them are sunscreens that you don't want to wash off. Unless you get soiled, you probably should only do your groin and your underarms routinely, unless you're soiled, because you have skin flora and you're going to make certain molecules that nobody's interested in or looking at. I'm not saying that you're going to wash off D3. A lot of people think you can wash off D3. The D3 that you make is going to make its way into the vascular system and go into your body. It's made pretty deep in the epidermis, but you will make other molecules that are going to rise to the surface and act as sunscreens. And those are the ones I'm saying you can wash off.
Oh, right. So those are natural sun protections.
Yeah, and there's a ton of different molecules,
Mm.
you know, over 100, well over 100 different molecules. So then let's get to the pill, the issue with the pill. So you take the pill, you're forcing your lymphatic system to absorb it. You're getting LDL cholesterol to shuttle it around, and it may just end up stored in fat. Hopefully it's going to make it to the liver. If you need it, I'm sure it's going to make it to the liver. The body isn't stupid. Everybody needs to quit thinking the body's stupid. It might be broken in some fashion somewhere, but it's not stupid. It'll never get that stupid.
Yeah.
So the D3 is then becomes 25D in the liver. And then as it's needed, it will then become the 125D. The problem is that if you have runaway 125D, that's a control molecule for other things. So people worry about osteoporosis and they think they need to take vitamin D for osteoporosis. Vitamin D is probably most people's cause of their osteoporosis. What it boils down to is when you increase your vitamin D in your blood, and healthy people aren't sequestering it. Let me tell you that. It's the sick people that are sequestering it. So healthy people, they can have quite a bit of it released into their blood. But if you don't check your 125D, that's going to be the one that leads to hypercalcemia. Your hypercalcemia control axis is your parathyroid hormone, PTH, ionized calcium, and 125D. So we have a lot of people labeled with low vitamin D, 25D. They're said to have osteoporosis as a consequence of that. But you never check their active vitamin D. And if it's high, that's telling the body it needs more calcium in that axis, in that control axis. And so if it's not available in the gut through your diet at that moment, it's going to go and pull it from bone in something called resorption. And so that's what's happening to a lot of people that aren't checking their active form of vitamin D, especially the sick people. They'll be increasing their blood level of vitamin D, which will be increasing their needed calcium in serum, and it'll be pulled from bone. And that's exactly how we kill rodents. We kill mice and rodents with vitamin D. We give them so much vitamin D without any calcium that they'll resorb calcium from their bone, and they'll get kidney stones of the calcium and stuff, and it kills them really quickly.
And that's really interesting. One of the things I learned in functional medicine training with Chris Kresser was to always check parathyroid hormone along with. So we didn't learn about active D. We only, it was kind of the mainstream, I guess, that we were only checking 25D, but always to check parathyroid hormone. And that the level of parathyroid hormone dictated whether the person would need vitamin D supplementation or not. What are your thoughts about that?
In the correctly working system in somebody's body that isn't dysregulated, it's going to be the 125D that is the control piece there, along with PTH and ionized calcium. Keep in mind, most people aren't checking ionized calcium. There's only a slight difference. They're pretty close. But I think if the regular calcium were high, so would also be the ionized calcium. But keep in mind, calcium is one of the main reasons that people think they're taking vitamin D. Did any of them have low calcium?
Mm,
There's
no.
not very many people with low calcium, yet they're taking vitamin D knowing it's going to increase their calcium.
Well, I mean, it's been interesting for me because I did what I learned, and so and with a lot of opposition, but I always ask for PTH, and so twice now I've found, you know, hyperparathyroid whatever, you know, it's been
Right.
elevated and people have needed to, you know, have treatment and stuff for that. So in one way, I feel that's been a little bit validated, but
Sure. And like I said earlier, hypoparathyroidism will result in low 125D. Typically, hyperparathyroidism results in high 125D, quite typically.
And so now the body's pulling all this calcium out of the bone. Oh, it's increasing the gut's ability to absorb calcium from the diet. It's pulling calcium out of the bone. And now we've got too much calcium. And so now we've got a problem with calcification in the body.
Right. Which is exactly how we're killing those rodents.
Yeah. And so does that increase? So that increased calcium leads to kidney stones?
And overworking the kidneys, activating it as well.
Yeah. And then also, you know, I have seen connections with cardiovascular disease and, you know, plaque atherogenesis, you know, increased calcium levels in arteries. Are there other things that it affects?
Those are kind of it. But also you have to keep in mind when you're causing the body to do work, whether it's shuffling calcium, pulling it from bone, you're gonna tax your immune system. You're gonna task the osteocytes. They're gonna have to make osteoblasts and osteoclasts to deal with the bone. And what can happen is you can exhaust your ability to do that in your life. You can exhaust your telomeres to create those cell lines. They'll only happen so many times in your life. Then you end up with a lot of people that aren't able to do that when they get older. And then you've got the drug companies waiting with things like Fosamax and Boniva for you to halt that process.
So it's, you know, everything all comes back to, you know, here's a pharmaceutical you can take.
Right. Well, and then let's talk about when I said you go in the sun and you make D3 and it becomes L3, and I told you that's a pretty important molecule. Yeah. It makes a lot of other molecules. What happened early on in the vitamin D world is that they looked at its influence on calcium, because we started really looking at it over rickets, which is related to bone health and stuff. So but that has to do with what position on the backbone of the vitamin D molecule is hydroxylated. You can change it where the 25 and the 125D are altered. Both those kind of changes cause it to play in the calcium world. If it was altered in different locations, it's not calcemic at all. And so a lot of the molecules that the body makes don't have anything to do with calcium. They're doing completely other jobs, other maintenance. They're going to other receptors like the orphan retinoid receptors. So there's this whole host of vitamin D molecules no one's ever even heard of that are really at the heart of steroidogenesis. We just found them after we found this pathway we were focused on. But what ended up, I wanted to make this last connection though, but what ended up happening is they want to treat cancer and these other things with vitamin D, but the molecule, the 125D molecule, results in hypercalcemia in those people. Most cancer people are facing hypercalcemia anyway. That's a granulomatous process. It happens. And so they have now started to make synthetics that don't affect calcium. So what they're really doing is they've circled back around and are synthesizing the ones they abandoned that they called inert and worthless.
Yeah. And so how many, I know you've identified a number of other forms of vitamin D. How many have you come up with? I mean, I think I think I've heard you say that there's probably hundreds of them.
I had written it out and I had close to 100. I had found 15 different forms of 25D to begin with, and the test only looks at, if you had a really high power test, it'd look at 3 of those. And some of those other ones are you make in disease states that don't have anything to do with calcium. And so they aren't being measured in those sick people. And so that little fraction or faction that they're measuring, 2 out of 15, it's going to be low. But maybe they have a ton of the other stuff they're not checking, and it's busy working for them, but no one's looking at those. So, but one day I found a pathway, and I was looking at a D3 molecule, and that pathway supposedly had over 960 different molecules it could become. So I'm going to go with, there's over 1,000 easy.
Yeah, and we just know so little about it. I just wanted to talk about the rickets a bit, because some of the research I've seen about rickets was vitamin A played a really important role in rickets. And I think I saw a study out of Africa somewhere where they had given vitamin D, and the vitamin D made no difference. They needed more calcium in their diet, and vitamin A was one of the key components as well.
The vitamin A actually really makes sense because of what I said before, where the vitamin A and the vitamin D are both dimers, and they each have their respective receptors that come together and heterodimerize. So the biological action that would deal with rickets would involve vitamin A as well as D. So if they were low in A, yeah, no amount of D is going to make up for that. And in places where there's a lot of parasite load, vitamin A can be low. I've read where the vitamin angels go into Africa and they give the children 50,000 IU of vitamin A twice a year because of all the parasites and stuff.
Right. Yeah. That makes a whole lot of sense.
I think I also heard at one point that there was rickets-like manifestations related to vitamin C as well. I think I looked that up when the first time I was told that, and I think that is true. I think they did have bowed legs with scurvy.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I haven't seen that, but that's something worth looking into as well. So how do we get in this situation, Jim? What happened? Michael Hollick's comes to mind, and to me, he's one well-known vitamin D researcher, but we have all these other vitamin D researchers who completely disagree with him, and their research is supporting everything that you've told us today.
Right. It's really weird. I don't see how more people don't figure it out. The papers are out there, but the papers that I read, they're not about the deficiency. They're specifically about the molecules, and they tell you what they do. So you're able to see there's all these other molecules that are amazing, and you can find papers, and in your own mind, you can make that connection that the deficiency isn't real. But they keep showing just the 25D levels, and they keep blaming those. Like there were tons of them that came out with COVID where they'd say, oh, the people that do the worst are the ones that have the lowest 25D. Well, that's because those are the sick people. Yeah. Those are the people that are already sick. They have some comorbid condition because their body's already sequestering the 25D. Then they'll take that whole camp and they'll give from sick to well, and they'll give them vitamin D. And then the ones that are able to increase their vitamin D do better. Well, that's because, again, they're not sequestering it. They're not already the sick people. But that's held up as it's all about 25D. Look at these people. If you just get your 25D there. Well, hold on a second. What is their 125D? That will blow the entire association out of the water, because all of a sudden you'll see that those people that they're saying have low vitamin D actually have way higher active vitamin D than the people that are doing well.
Yeah.
So they just don't look at it. But Hollick, along with several other people that have jumped on the bandwagon, they just circular citation of each other to prop their science up. They're open to biased publishing about vitamin D. That's quite clear, because I've pointed out numerous times, you could measure those people's red blood cell magnesium, their vitamin C, their vitamin E. There's a lot of other proxies you could check in them that would be low. But if you found those things low in all of them, good luck publishing a paper on that. It's not going to happen. You're not going to publish a paper that low vitamin A is the cause of all the disease instead of 25D.
No, well, vitamin A is toxic, remember? I mean, that's another fallacy that we have out there.
Yeah, there's a lot of work on that. I haven't read the original stuff that people are talking about, but we only found the correct vitamin A molecule in 2016, and it's called A5. So
Right.
we've gone through 4 wrong ones already, and nobody's rushing to redo the science that was done on the wrong molecules for vitamin A. You know, vitamin D has its own little niche for some reason. And what's crazy is it's a molecule we actually make.
Mm, mm. So, way back, so when was it? I think from what I've read that you've written, was it 2011 or a bit earlier than that, when, the Institute of Medicine, what is it, the Institute of Health or something now?
Yeah, the Institutes of Medicine and New York Academy of Sciences.
Yeah.
So they were asked by Canada and the United States to look at all the published science on it and set a goal. And they did a pretty exhaustive piece on it. I know that the report was well over 1,000 pages long. I was waiting for it to come out. I think that began in 2008. I don't know when it actually was fully released, but by 2010, through Pollock's influence with the Endocrine Society, he got them to just completely ignore that and get everybody on the 30+ bandwagon.
Yeah, so they increased it so in nanograms per milliliter, which is what I think you work in, and we work in nanomoles per litre. So these numbers are different for New Zealand. But it used to be 12 was sufficient. And now what do they want? 30 or 40 or something?
30, and some people want to be around 80 to 100. It's kind of crazy a level. And there's some work by Robert Haney, I believe. He did some work where they looked at when you raise up your 25D in serum and you get it to a certain point, they wanted to see where that gets saturated and it starts to build D3 as well. And they found that, I don't actually remember which point it was at, but with the new goal, for sure, people now are building the 25D in their blood, but they're also building quite a volume of D3 in their blood, which isn't normal at all. That's not natural. Normally D3 progresses to 25D or your body doesn't hold on to it. So a lot of the people that are able to do that, they now have a lot of D3 and 25D in their blood. And if they were able to do that, they probably don't have a ton of 125D. This would be someone that's not dysregulated. But these molecules that they're able to build a ton of have a really long half-life. If they get in trouble with hypercalcemia or something like that, it could take months, especially when you take a ton of it, you'll store D3. That doesn't normally happen. Normally, all you'd store is 25D. So it could take months to years to get rid of the body's burden of a ton of vitamin D if you're able to truly saturate yourself with it.
And so we don't really know the consequences of having elevated D3 in the blood where it's not supposed to be.
No, there's not much literature on that at all. And this was a workshop, although you're able to find it, it's not truly published work. He even says in his comments, in unpublished work we did in so-and-so's lab.
Interesting.
So that's the net effect of the new goal. The net effect of the new goal is to build D3 in the people's blood, if you ask me, and that's just not natural. And to store it, that's not natural either.
And of course, so that's going to lead to the consequence that everybody's going to rock up and have low vitamin D.
Yeah, I mean, when they raise the goal like that overnight,
overnight,
how many people went in the net then? The net got much larger.
Yeah, today you're normal, tomorrow you're deficient, just because they changed the numbers.
Right. And there's been a lot of papers published called all-cause mortality studies for various molecules. But if you look at the vitamin D all-cause mortality studies, you'll see that the lowest mortality is in the 20 to 24 ng or 50 to 60 in your numbers, nanomole. That's the lowest mortality, 20 to 24. That's right at the cusp of deficient, deep in insufficiency world. And that's the highest survival. And when you get above 56, and I don't know what that works out to in your numbers, but 56, mortality increases. So that makes sense because people aren't able to get above 60 naturally. It takes pills to get above 60.
Yeah.
So mortality increases there. It's a reverse J-shaped curve, the mortality, all-cause mortality. Being low is bad and being high is bad. The thing is, low is much lower than people think, and high is much lower than people think as well.
And, you know, I'll just say again, all the studies that I've read just keep reiterating how disappointing vitamin D supplementation has been on all those health outcomes for the elderly, you know, osteoporosis, and also they also mention it doesn't decrease or cause mortality either. So anyone can go and, you know, there's a stack of papers out there. And if anyone's interested, I mean, I suggest they go to your site because you've got so much research and so much information. But I can also send anyone who's interested a pile of papers that I've been having a look at as well.
Yeah, we've had huge studies, Vital, in Haynes. There were several different studies, and they just kept saying, just wait, the proof's going to come out, the proof's come out, and they're deflating. I think they called it a deflating result. You know, they had to use adjectives like seems and appears, and you know, that's the point at where we're at in the science. Those aren't scientific words. Vitamin D appears to, you know, and if you think of all the symptoms that people have associated with it, vitamin D doesn't even play a biological role in those things. Sweating from the forehead. What is having more vitamin D? How does it get in there and block you from sweating from the forehead? It just doesn't have a role in that. It has a role in the bone things. It can lead to arterial sclerosis, like you mentioned earlier, things like that. But they blame everything on it. They want to blame a bad haircut on it these days.
Yeah. Well, someone just, you know, gets interested in something and we forget about the biological action of all these things need to be working together. And, you know, we just keep, oh, well, we'll take this or we'll take that, or this is going to solve our problem. And really it's about getting well and healthy in a complete sense, not just trying to take something to solve a short-term problem.
Right.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. So what are your recommendations for people? So, I mean, I just want to emphasize, no way are you saying vitamin D is not important. You're saying vitamin D supplementation, for the most part, unless people have these kind of specific problems,
right,
unnecessary. And what are your recommendations with regard to getting adequate vitamin D?
So you want to get reasonable sun. And when you're getting reasonable sun for your health, you have to forego the sunglasses because the retina needs a certain amount of light needs to get into the retina. I'm not saying look at the sun, but don't block it with polar, any kind of sunglasses that are going to block it when you're getting health. I'm not telling you never to wear sunglasses. We do have risks of, eye related issues. There's a lot to be considered, but when you're getting sun for health, the eyes are able to do melanogenesis. They control the melanogenesis, the retina does. So you have a certain amount of melanin already. It can shuffle that like umbrellas on the fly and help you not get burned at that time. It'll also request and usher new in by asking it to be created. Depends on the light frequencies you're exposed to. Vitamin or UVA and UVB both cause melanogenesis. Both can get you darker. So you want to get reasonable sun. You want to avoid all those toxic sunscreens. They're terrible. If you can't find a good healthy one, make one or whatever. There's clothing that blocks it, of course. You can do that. Depends on how hot it is where you're trying to get your sun. But the lion's share of vitamin D, especially all those other molecules nobody knows about, are going to come from sun exposure. They're not going to come out of a bottle, they're not. So that's the basis of it. Food can eat the right food. It's foods that naturally contain D3, not the fortified ones, but say a salmon fillet or eggs, something like that. They also contain 25D. They just don't bother to put it on the label. So there's more vitamin D in a lot of the food sources. About a year ago, I discovered that most of the angiosperms, I looked at 4 classes of angiosperms, they all make vitamin D. So one of them was pumpkin and squash. Look at when we're harvesting that, right in the fall, when the UVB is starting to wane. And so that makes sense. Cereal grains, what was some of the other things? Lentils. So I've looked at 4 different angiosperms, but they assume that they're probably all going to be vitamin D containing foods. So get it from the healthy natural foods. Honey is a great source of vitamin D. I refer to it as liquid sunshine. There's at least 5 different molecules in it, including substrates to make other pathway molecules.
Right.
So that's a perfect source right there. Anything that's considered a cofactor, you're going to want to be consuming. You want to get everything you can out of diet. And sometimes we think it's hard to get certain things out of diet. Look first. Maybe it isn't. Like I thought quercetin. I thought I was going to have to do quercetin pills if I wanted to. No, quercetin's in all kinds of things we eat. So look at the food sources. Anytime studies have shown certain molecules to be beneficial, it basically turns out it was from food stuff, from nutritions. It really never was from isolated pills that helped. So that in and of itself, you mentioned zinc earlier.
Yeah.
Zinc, zinc is really important, and you can get that in your diet too. The reason zinc is so important in the vitamin D world, and probably in all vitamin D receptors are called nuclear receptors. One form of them. The one we're talking about is a nuclear receptor. All that means is after the vitamin A receptor and stuff come together, they leave the cell surface where the molecules first arrived, and they go into the nucleus, and that's where everything happens. So there's other nuclear receptors. So what I'm about to say probably applies to all of them. There's a section on there where the DNA goes, and then the vitamin D molecules, they go on and sit there. But where they park, there's 2 zinc fingers where some of the stuff parks. And that's why you need zinc, because people don't realize receptors only last about 6 to 8 hours half-life before protease or something else comes along and destroys them. And a receptor is just a protein the body made that's folded in a very special way. So they're dynamic situation. So you need the zinc as your body's trying to create those receptors.
And so what about the role of copper in that? Is there a role for copper there?
There's not a role of copper in the direct vitamin D metabolism. And copper is something I wish that I could take a decade or 2 to study. It's one of those things that has a valence, I think is how you say it. It has electrons, I believe it is, to give. It can have 6 to 8 inside its structure. So copper is super important. I feel that copper is completely ignored for iron. And I think that iron displaces copper. So I think that you should make sure that you have healthy copper in your diet. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Think of the things that aren't added for us versus the things that are added for us. Yeah. And it's the negative template. We probably don't need the things or the direct form they're choosing for us, but we need the things they aren't putting in there.
Yeah. And, you talked about that copper, that iron dysregulation earlier, and how we're, so many people are iron dysregulated, not iron, not anemic or iron, low in iron,
Right.
And so copper, like you just mentioned, copper is so important for that. And the reason I mentioned copper was just because, copper and zinc play this intimate role together with their own receptors. So, people are supplementing with zinc, which could then affect their copper.
Right.
Their copper level, so it's hugely complex.
Right. And it's a form of zinc that protects you from lead too. I think it's called zinc propylene, something. It starts with a P, zinc P something. Yeah. And when they do lead tests on you, they also test that form of zinc to make sure that it's part of the test. So zinc is protective to some heavy metal damage too.
Yeah. And yeah, essential for, I mean, again, it's got its own whole list of things that it's essential for. What about magnesium? Does magnesium play a role with vitamin D and
Yeah.
vitamin
Each step of the activation of vitamin D, so the move from D3 to 25D uses magnesium. The change from that to 125D uses magnesium. I have a little chart that shows the pathways, and anytime magnesium is used, it has a little circle with Mg in it, and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, that'd be great. I'll make sure I include it with all the show notes.
Right.
And one of the things, another comment, just going back to something you talked about earlier, right at the beginning, was breast milk. You know, we're seeing babies now are being given vitamin D3 when they're born, newborns, because
Right.
mum's milk is low in vitamin D. And you have to say, well, you know, for the whole evolution of humans, we obviously didn't think that breast milk needed high amounts of vitamin D, because otherwise we would have evolved to have it.
Right. It goes again with that thing where they consider it low based upon the goal they set for it, though. You know, not what the body's doing, but that is a complete myth that pregnant women have low vitamin D. They have spikes in active vitamin D around 40%. So it's quite the opposite. They have a lot of vitamin D, and it looks like we are hormone imprinting the children in the womb with this theory. And that's all it is. It's not bearing out. It's probably the cause of celiacs and asthma and things like that. It's not good to have a really powerful secosteroid being basically passed on to the child while it's trying to form. And most of the vitamin D work from the experts, and this would include Hollick, DeLuca, probably Haney, and all them, they don't see a role for vitamin D before birth in any of the rodents they looked at. And so they think that's probably the same in the human body. And I'll drop a bombshell here. The bone in the fetus is basically made with endocannabinoids, not vitamin D molecules. And so that's a whole different story. And there's 15 different endocannabinoids in breast milk.
Gosh, you know, there is just so much to all of this, Jim, and you know, I really appreciate you, because I know how deep and complicated you can get when you're explaining all this. Yeah. So I really appreciate you simplifying it for me and everybody else, and I really encourage people to go and have a look at your work if they're interested in finding out a lot more. Whereabouts can they find you?
So on Facebook, I'm at secosteroid hormone D. They can join that. I have a Substack. I'll have to send you the link to that. Yeah. I hadn't been that active on it recently, but I will stay active on it. On my Substack, I've written focused papers for people, like one specifically on D2, one on D3, one on D4. So those papers are really good with all the resources to get your head around those molecules. And it's kind of hard to think of how to progress that and bring them all together. That's where it starts to confuse people. So I try to do a foundation there for people to just start to understand the molecules.
Excellent. And then there's also, you have a number of podcasts out there. I know Morley talks about you a lot, and Morley highly recommends everybody go and follow you. You're kind of the guru in the vitamin D world. So there's podcasts with him, and then Matt Blackburn, and then I think I've seen and heard a few other podcasts. So anyone who wants to go a bit deeper, because some of those go quite a lot deeper into all the mechanisms and things like that. But today I just wanted to keep it a little bit simple so people can start to get their head around the concept and really reevaluate whether they need to be taking vitamin D supplements. Right.
And you can talk with your people and they can generate questions, and we can do another podcast. We can do focused. You could have people on to ask questions if you wanted, whatever you think. I want to help people. Absolutely.
I would do that. I do a Q&A once a month with, with outside experts coming in. So perhaps you and I could organise, could set up a time to do that, and we'll get people to come in with all their questions, and and you can answer them directly then. Yeah,
that'd be good. If you were to go to YouTube and do Jim Stephenson Jr., you'll find a lot of mine there on YouTube. And there's one that I did with Stephanie. It's episode 49. When you start searching, it'll say it's episode 49. I did it with Stephanie. That was the first time I brought graphics into the podcast.
Yeah.
That's a really good one to watch, because I really connect a lot of dots with graphic information so that you can really get your head around it.
Perfect. Well, I will find that link, and I'll make sure I put that in the show notes as well. Because the graphics really do help, I think, too. Yeah, definitely. Are there any last kind of comments you'd like to make? I'll have a quick look at all my notes, pages of notes. Talked about what I would tell people is if they start to research this, they're going to talk to their doctors or other people that really feel that they already know vitamin D, and they're going to be told, oh, you're wrong. That's not wrong. You're going in the wrong direction. These are the people you want to ask if they've ever seen a paper that demonstrated the vitamin D deficiency in the active form, because that's what's necessary. Those papers don't exist. When COVID first happened, Robert Kennedy has his Children's Defense Health Fund group, and they were posting about how vitamin D was going to be the ticket to fixing the COVID issues. And I contacted them, and at first they weren't responsive, but then I told them, I know lots of people that I could get to email you until you pay attention to me. And that got a response from them. And I got to talk to the person who was doing their vitamin D research. And she was getting ready to talk to all the big researchers and get their 125D study data sets. Right. And I told her, there's no data sets for that. You're just not going to, so you're going to be disappointed. And about 4 months later, I checked back with her, and she said, you're right. I can't believe that. No one checks it. There's not a single paper on the deficiency. There's not a single person with COVID that they pointed to their 25D that they also have the 125D for. And she realized if they weren't going to measure that during COVID, they're never going to measure it. Yeah. And, there's so many, so many doctors and specialists and alternative health practitioners who I have so much respect for. They're doing great work. And I always post about contacting you on their posts, because I'm like, no, not vitamin D, stop, right. Please stop recommending it. Because everybody I know is like, oh, I take vitamin D and zinc. It'll protect me from COVID, and it's good for my health. And, you kind of want to pull your hair out a little bit. Right. Somebody put together a bunch of studies that were supposedly supportive of vitamin D for COVID. I want to say there were well over 100 studies in that thing. And I actually wrote a critique of that. I went and opened those studies and looked at them, and vitamin D science is super weak, folks. You need to realize that it's completely a house of cards. It's as weak as can be. It's just not real. I think I read one of your things you'd written, like snakes in the grass. Was right? Yeah. So that's a long piece. That was over 20 pages long. Yeah, that was a really great piece. And I really liked how you took each of the points and then managed to, debunk them and use the actual quotes out of the research. Right. Right. Great piece. Yeah. Yeah. So you obviously saw that in the Word document where it had the color still intact, so you could really see that. Yeah, that's really important. Yeah. So the one that you did on COVID, is that available? Is that on the site as well? I don't know that I put that on the site, but I will look for it. I'll see if I can find that for you, and I'll send it to you. Yeah, I'd really like to have a look at that, because then it gives you a bit more ammunition to just ask questions, not attack people, but just say,
Right.
well, just say, hey, look, there might be another point of view. Have you looked at this?
Right.
Show me some studies that support what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah. So just to wrap up, vitamin D toxicity, because I know that that's a thing, and I know on your Facebook page there are a lot of people who have overdosed on vitamin D and are really suffering the consequences. You talked about rosemary and
sage.
Rosemary and
They're in the same family.
Yeah. So you talked about them as helping. What else would you suggest? Is there anything else? Is there any kind of treatment, sauna, red light therapy? Is there anything else people can do to help themselves?
Other than the rosemary and the sage to help you get your receptors available again, and the cofactors, there's nothing really that comes to mind right now that I'm thinking of. Those are the big ones, and the reasonable sun without sunscreen. That's going to be huge, because if you spend a little more time in the sun and don't get burned, you're probably going to start making other molecules in more abundance than you have in the past.
Right. Yeah. And then also, you're going to make all those other vitamin D molecules that you talked about, but then there's also all the other benefit. We know for our immune system and our cells, to have that light exposure and how that full spectrum of light can get into cells and change help mitochondria function, and really help our health. So it's huge.
Right. Yeah. Light is life. We need to start realizing that, there's no life without light, really, pretty much. So you just got to get some reasonable light and eat a good diet. That's huge.
Excellent. Well, Jim, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for coming on and following me up yesterday.
Right. Well, I'm happy to do it. Absolutely. We'll do this again then.